When most people think of Bretton Woods, they're thinking of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank and the idea of a new financial architecture in the aftermath of World War II. And it was all of that and more. But the core issue was this concept that the United States military would go out and make the global oceans safe for anyone's commerce, no matter who you were, no matter what you did, no matter where you were selling, no matter who you were partnering with. Anyone could go anywhere. And that was a fundamental change in the international environment because it allowed countries that honestly had lost the war and lost badly to emerge from the wreckage with trade access as if they were the world's most powerful empire and could get anywhere at any time.
The fund is essential to winning and preserving peace. That is why the representatives of 44 nations here in Bretton Woods are taking steps to prevent a repetition of the currency chaos which has usually followed in the wake of war.
There was a catch there. For the Americans to do this for you, you had to sign up to be on our side during the Cold War. And that provided us with the alliance network that we needed to contain and ultimately beat back the Soviet Union.
It is up to the rest of us to stand behind the credit of the devastated and undeveloped countries and take our share in guaranteeing the lenders from ultimate loss. The whole world will join together in a mutual credit pool to shoulder risks which private investors might be unwilling to run.
Another characteristic of this structure was that the United States would not invest its economy in this new international network, because if it had done that, it would have just been another conquering empire. So we got this global structure where the United States did the heavy lifting on a security front and allowed this parallel economic structure to happen on a global basis, of which the Americans were at most side participants in. It's not that we didn't play at all, but as a percentage of GDP, we remain the least involved economy in the world, especially if you factor out the NAFTA countries. In terms of total import-export, where you're looking at something that's less than 5% of GDP. The numbers are going to be different based on who's doing the data, because different people weight different things differently and don't even count certain things. And when you're talking about modern manufacturing, where there's thousands of supply chain steps, getting good data is difficult at best. But pretty much everybody's data says that somewhere between 10 and 20% of US GDP is involved in imports and exports in some way. But roughly half of that is the NAFTA network. And roughly a third of what's left is U.S. energy and energy product exports. And so if you pull those out, you're talking 5% of GDP is all that's left. If you go up until 1992, because that's where we have a bit of a split in policy and decision making, up until that point, pretty much all of our involvement in the Middle East wasn't about getting crude out of the region for us. It was about getting crude out of the region for our allies, because the North American market for energy has largely been self-contained since the beginning. Remember that we were one of the major exporters during World War II that allowed the Europeans and even the Russians to fight. That generated a very different economic model, because we experienced things like the oil shocks in the 70s because oil prices are internationally linked. It is a broadly fungible and liquid commodity financially. But we were never in danger of an actual shortage. It was a price issue here. The shortage was an Eastern Hemispheric problem. It was a problem for Japan. It was a problem for Germany. And that's why we were involved, because the idea was if the United States does not rise to the occasion and contain instability in the Middle East, then the allies would no longer have an economic interest in partnering with the United States on security affairs. And for us, that was the only thing that mattered. And that's the reason why Iran, once it turned fundamentalist in 1979, was always an issue, because Iran always had that threat over the Persian Gulf energy exports. And if that went away, the alliance could theoretically go away. And so even now, 40 years later, when the United States is more and more populist and is less interested in maintaining all of this for any number of reasons, mostly domestic politics, we still get this knee-jerk reaction to anything that happens against Iran because we have been so exposed. That has always been the raw nerve. In many ways, Iran has always been the country on the planet that had the greatest capacity to disrupt our overall security plans. Now, I would argue that's no longer the case. We've moved on. But the emotional inertia there is immense. And we're certainly seeing that in political decisions today. You have to go back to the fact that we won the Cold War. And after 1992, we started to have a conversation with ourselves about what's Bretton Woods 2? How do we take this alliance, the greatest alliance in human history, and play it forward for another generation or two of American preeminence? How do we remake the human condition? How do we spread free market capitalism? How do we improve the rates of human rights? How do we push women's rights? How do we make the world a better place that we can then leave to our descendants? And the person who tried to get us to have that conversation was George Herbert Walker Bush. And Americans decided that they didn't want to have that conversation. And instead, we went with Bill Clinton, who was much more focused on North America, much more populist and narcissistic. And from there, we went to W. Bush, and from there to Obama, and Obama to Trump, and Trump to Biden. And we've just kind of taken steps down that road. Despite the variety of policies and personalities that we have seen since 1992, what they all have in common is each one is a little bit more economically nationalist than the one that came before. So from an economic and political point of view, we've moved away from this structure. And while that's happened, we've also changed our military, specifically the Navy, into a form that I would argue is no longer even capable of maintaining the globalized network. We used to have a 600-ship Navy dominated by small vessels that could be almost everywhere at once. And so the idea of keeping the sea lanes open against threats was a viable policy. But since 1992, we've steadily reduced the size of the fleet while steadily increasing its tonnage. And so instead of having 600 ships that are mostly small, we now have about 250 ships that are centered around the aircraft carrier battle groups, of which we now have 12 supercarriers and 10 jump carriers. And it's really hard for us to function independently of that anymore. Now, if you want to carry out a military operation and knock over a country, you have the right tools for the job. But if you want to throw a wide net and provide naval security everywhere, we no longer have the numbers or the types of ships that are necessary. Look at what's going on in the Red Sea right now with the Houthis taking pot shots at shipping. It is stressing us to the brink of keeping the Red Sea open because we no longer have enough vessels of the type that could do this. The Houthis are arguably the worst terrorists in the world, operating from the most worthless chunk of land. And if we had a second event like this anywhere in the world, I doubt the U.S. Navy could rise to the occasion. So this is pushing us to the very brink of what is possible with our current military posture. And if it fails, the United States is not the country that's going to feel the pain. The country that's going to feel the most pain by far is going to be China because they're the most dependent on open seas. Even if they wanted to police, they don't have the ships with the range to get there. Well, like I said, they're the most incompetent terrorists in the world operating from the most worthless land. The only reason at all, in my opinion, that the Houthis matter is because every once in a while they take shots at the Saudi oil complex. But over the last 10 years, the Saudis have put up nets and jammers, which have pretty much reduced the damage to zero. So I am going to go with a big fat don't really care. It's not just politics that is driving the United States away from the system. I'd argue between demographic changes, economic reality, the Chinese rise, and the shift in the American naval posture that we can't do it anymore. We're going to have to do something Americans really hate doing. We're going to have to make some choices about what we want to protect and what we want to further. And it's really hard for me to see Yemen being part of that conversation. The region overall, whenever you got an area that's dry to desert, it's hard to have basic agriculture. And if you don't have agriculture, you never get small businesses and you never move up into, say, manufacturing and industry. And so this region has always been left behind. The places where that is least true are the places where it rains. And that is Turkey, and that is Tunisia, and to a lesser degree, Morocco, which are the three most economically advanced states in the region by any measure. The Israelis are unique in many, many, many ways, mostly because when the Jews were brought back in the post-World War II environment, they brought a lot of skill sets that they had developed elsewhere over centuries with them, and a lot of capital, in addition to the strategic sponsorship of the West in general, the United States in particular. And that gave the Israelis access to trade options that no one else in the region had, but they also started working with skill sets that no one else in the region had. And that's allowed them to build up a bit of a technocracy in a region that is known for anything but. You got this weird little pocket of service economy and high-tech manufacturing in a sea of something else. And it is because of the people, not because of their ethnicity, but because you've had, a few million people who now call themselves Israelis who for generations lived somewhere else. It's a full-on graft. And it's part of the reason why North America and Australia are just so different from Europe. They took the skill sets that they originated in another place and applied them to a new geography and made something new, for better or for worse. Now, maintaining the security of a little statelet like that under normal circumstances is impossible because this region, the Levant specifically, has never been powerful enough to look after itself. It's never had the population density to generate a military force that can keep things at bay. And so it's always been at the whim of greater powers, whether those powers be the Turks or the Persians or once even the Mongols. That countering that, the forces of history and just the sheer demographic overbalance of the tiny size of Israel versus the huge heft of these other players requires a lot of really creative thinking. And what the Israelis have done, sometimes in league with outside powers, sometimes not, is one after another turn the countries that border them either into allies like Egypt, into security proxies like Jordan, basically has become a dependency, or break them. In the case of Lebanon, basically becoming a failed state. And I'd argue Syria is pretty close to that as well. It doesn't solve the broader problem of a partnership with those larger outside powers to prevent invasion, but it does give whoever is going to cross in from elsewhere the fact that they have to cross through these other areas first. So let's assume, for example, that the last country that occupied what is today Israel, Turkey, decided it wanted to come back. Well, first it would have to absorb Lebanon and Syria, and there's no one in Turkey who thinks that would be a lot of fun. So it's kind of a firebreak strategy. I don't want to suggest that it's going to work forever, but it's working for now. If it hadn't been for the Gaza war, we would probably already have a formal peace deal between the Israelis and the Saudis. Now, they have been cooperating fairly tightly for 15 years now. There's a lot of Israeli forces that basically train the Saudis on their own equipment. There's a lot of intelligence cooperation on both sides, especially vis-a-vis Iran. I'm not suggesting that they agree on everything, but whenever the Americans have put official or unofficial sanctions on either country for human rights abuses, they turn to one another in order to play the United States off of whatever the issue happens to be, and then provide direct assistance to the other one in order to get what they want anyway. And it's been a fairly successful model so far because the Americans have not called them on it. So they've had a de facto alliance, I would argue, for at least a decade. And the question that has been up in recent months is whether just to make that formal. There's a generational split within Saudi Arabia about whether they should go formal and get something for the Palestinians as part of it, or just throw the Palestinians under the bus and make it official. And that is a conversation that is very much in play. So in terms of a security guarantor, Saudi Arabia can't play that role. But if the Israelis can flip Saudi Arabia to formally being on the same side as Egypt and Jordan and Morocco, and at least neutral like Turkey is, then you really don't have to worry about the Arab side of the external security threats. And that would be a significant victory. And I think that is now within reach. And I think we're definitely going to see that this decade. The Iranian problem isn't going away, but it's distant. And no one is thinking that there's about to be another Persian empire that's going to expand out and occupy the entire region. The Iranians are too technologically inept at the moment to pull anything like that off. So, that's a problem for a different century. The internal problem, I think, is going to be more of an issue. The success of Israel owes more to itself than it does to American sponsorship. It is because you've got this highly educated population that has carved a little bit green out of the desert, that's made them high value add, that's made their intelligence systems great, that's made their weapon systems among the world's best. But at the same time, they've created this space within their own political and economic system for a class of people who reject everything about modern life and basically study religious texts all day and have a bunch of kids and live on state subsidies. And that's like 30 to 40% of the population now. And so you've got this is going to sound incredibly jaded, but a near deadbeat population who is sucking at the teat of the government and sucking the government dry, and yet all voting together in a relatively anti-economic, anti-Arab, anti-peace, anti-cooperation, anti-military bloc. And they're just, the leaders that get put in from this population are absolutely incompetent. Yet they claim that they represent the true soul of the people, and they claim that they're the security hawks, and they claim They know more about how to run the military than the generals. And their incompetence is in many ways what led to the surprise of last October and November when Hamas made their move. These were the people who were in charge of those institutions, and they ignored all the warnings that were coming up from the professionals who had been in their jobs for decades, and they did so for political reasons. So 3 big problems. Number one, this is a region that has gotten most of its energy from the Russian space, so that's a problem, especially since that's obviously their number one security threat. They're in the process of trying to wrestle with that right now from a late start. Number 2, this is part of the world that industrialized and urbanized very intensely after World War II. And after 70 years, their birth rates have now been so low for so long that Germany and Italy and, those are the big ones, will cease to function as modern economic entities within 10 or 15 years because it's not that they ran out of children. That happened 30 years ago. They're running out of working age adults this decade. There is no economic model that works there. And then number 3,
immigration isn't the solution to that?
The problem there is scale. So take Germany, a country with a little over 80 million people. For them just to hold the line where they are right now, they would need to import 2 million people under age 25 every year for the next 20 years, just to hold the line of where they are now. And that would mean in 20 years, the Germans would be a small minority within their own country. It's not viable. If you want immigration to be part of the solution, you start early, you make it a trickle, you never let up. And you have to consign yourself to a degree of cultural change. If the longer you wait, the more you need to bring in, the sharper the change will be. And for the European nation states, I just don't think it's a viable option, or at least not at scale. There may be some individual exceptions here and there. And there now are a lot of Ukrainians that are looking to settle in a new place. But if all of the Ukrainians who have left, that's a quarter of the population of Ukraine is left for Europe. If they all settled in Germany, that's still not enough. Just the immigration as a lever requires a lot of early action. And what that means is you've got an entire continent that is aging towards obsolescence. They no longer have enough people who are young to perpetuate the populations, but that also means they don't have enough people who are young to do the consuming of the economic outputs, which means the third problem, that Germany, Europe in general, is an export-led economic system, and that only works as long as someone is willing to absorb those exports. The United States is turning more nationalist and populist, and it's shrinking what's available. And the Chinese system, even if it survives, which I'm sure we can talk about that next, no longer has a lot of young people either. So most of the exports to China have been in the form of industrial plant to help the Chinese export to yet more countries. It's a bit of a daisy chain that even if you remove issues of ethics and morals and solidarity in Ukraine and Russia from, still is a bit of a starvation diet because there just aren't enough countries with young populations to absorb this volume of advanced age economies exports beyond the end of this decade. So it's a model that is very clearly dying by any number of means, even if the United States decides it still wants to partnership with Europe. And it's not clear that that is the case for the long term. If you look at what's happening with the Biden administration vis-a-vis the Europeans on the topic of Ukraine, every single deal has been about security. Their trade hasn't been brought up once. There is no stomach in the Biden White House to push towards any sort of trade arrangement with the Europeans that will buy them more time. There's 2 big problems if you want to look to, say, automation to solve these problems. Number 1 is that automation is very expensive, and it's more expensive to maintain it than it is to install it. So it's a cost that builds as you go. And as people move into mass retirement, their ability to generate capital to fund this sort of thing declines. So if you can't front load it, it's probably not going to happen. And then second, let's say you can figure it out. You can automate everything. Okay, well, that may address the production side of the equation. But Europe's problem hasn't been production. It's been consumption. And robots, at least yet, don't consume.
Don't buy things.
In a, quote, normal, unquote, system, especially before World War II, you had a pyramid structure. You had very few retirees, and then slightly more mature workers, people in their 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And below that, even more young workers in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s. And below that, lots and lots and lots of children. It's a traditional pre-industrial demographic structure because it's all about having lots of free kids because they're free labor on the farm. But as globalization kicked in, we all started to specialize because all of a sudden we were all part of one extended network. And specialization meant services and manufacturing jobs, and all of those were in town. So we started moving into the cities, and in cities, kids are no longer free labor, they're an expense. And you fast forward 70 years, and adults just had fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer of them. And after 70 years, the pyramid has shifted. At first, it was just you had fewer children and then fewer young adults, and it kind of became a chimney. And that gave us this absolutely magical growth structure, especially in the West, and especially in East Asia, from the 60s and the 70s up until almost now. Because you had a lot of people who were aged 20 to 65, but very few retirees and very few children. So all of the investment, all of the tax base, which was huge, could be spent on infrastructure and technology and education. And we got the fastest economic growth that we have ever seen as a species. And it moved around, but more or less lasted for 70 years. Well, you can only do that once. You can only urbanize once. And you can only benefit from that perfect demographic moment once. And what's happening now is there have been so few kids born for so long that most of the advanced economies, and this includes Germany and Italy and Japan and China, it's not that they've run out of kids or teenagers or 20-somethings or 30-somethings. They're now running out of 40-somethings and 50-somethings. And we have this massive inversion. It looks kind of like a top with the wide spot now approaching mass retirement. And what happens this decade is that wide spot moves past retirement. And we get to a situation where it's not where we have more retirees than children. We passed that a while ago. It's we have more retirees than we have children and young adults put together. And we have no idea what that will mean for our normal economic models of fascism and socialism and capitalism, because those are all based on growth, based on population. And that is now impossible for most of the largest economies of the world. In the case of the United States, it's a bit of an exception. We're still in that chimney stage, and our birth rate hasn't dropped enough to condemn us to that future. If we keep aging at the rate we're doing now, we won't be in a German-style situation until about 2070. Hopefully, that's a lot of time to figure out a new path, or at least, worst case scenario, we get to see how the Germans and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans and everyone else deals with this devolution. And hopefully, we'll learn a few things about what to do or even just what not to do. So you've got your American boomers and then your global boomers. They were formed at roughly the same time by roughly the same reason. The post-World War II euphoria when the GIs came home, they had a bunch of kids. Those are the boomers. And that happened even in the Soviet Union. The difference between the United States and most of the rest of the world is that our boomers had a lot of kids, and we know those as the millennials. And so we do have an echo boomer generation, and that's a big part of why our demographic decline has been so much slower. But that didn't happen almost anywhere else. So when the boomers die everywhere else, they've probably will have already absorbed all of the accrued capital from their lifetimes in pensions and healthcare because they won't be paying taxes in the same volume anymore. And that'll bankrupt the states. And there's no longer a replacement generation down below to replenish the population. So you're looking at aging populations, denigrating populations, less investment capacity because there's never the capital generation to exist in the first place now. In the United States, that's not necessarily true. I mean, I firmly believe that America's boomers aren't going to pass a lot of money on to their kids because they're going to spend it on themselves. But we still have that younger generation coming up. The older boomers turn 45 years old this year. And that means in about 10 years, they're going to be entering their capital-rich stage of their life.
The older boomers...
I'm sorry. I said that wrong. The older millennials turn 45 this year. And as a rule, from age 55 to 65 is when you're the most capital-rich in your life. That's what everyone else in the world is losing. We just have a hiccup. As the boomers pass on, Gen X is small, but then the millennials will eventually catch up. So I'm using air quotes here, all we have to do in the United States to get back to a better capital generation moment is wait 12 years until the millennials will be doing it. But there aren't a lot of other countries in the world that will ever reach that point. France, New Zealand, Sweden, that's about it. I wouldn't expect to see a Germany in 2070. I mean, that's part of the problem here. Everything that we're studying demographically, this has never happened before, never in human history. We've never seen this sort of decay, even in times of war and genocide, even in times of the Black Death.